It's time to change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
Today we're finishing up our series on the life of David, where David's life, it didn't end in the book of 2nd Samuel, but it ends here in the first two chapters of 1st Kings, where 1st Kings is just a continuation of 2nd Samuel. And originally 1st Kings and 2nd Kings were just one book in the Hebrew Bible until it was separated when the Torah was translated into Greek. And together, 1st and 2nd Kings, they cover 400 years of history of Israel. And it identifies 8 kings of Judah that are all descended from King David, which all leads us to the coming of the Messiah, Jesus. But we're not studying the book of 1st Kings today, but we're just finishing up the life of David. So today we find the people of Israel again in crisis because David is on his deathbed and the country's future is uncertain. And we're told here in the very first verse that David is old. And we know that David is about 70 years old here, where for some, 70 isn't old, but for others, 60s are old. And so David, he has lived a lot of life in these last 70 years, and it's taken a toll on his body. And so his body is beginning to fail. So now he stays in bed all day, and he can't get warm. So he's not like Moses, where Moses, he died at full strength at the age of 120. Or he's not like a Caleb who was still able to fight in his 80s. But with David, he's been fading away. And it appears that he's been living in seclusion, not wanting to be seen by many people. So he's not wanting to entertain any guests. We're just getting through the day seems to be enough. And through the rest of this book, we never see David ever leave his room or even get out of his bed. And David, he doesn't want to be seen that way because he doesn't feel good anymore. And for him, just to keep warm, he needs help. And they've already tried putting a lot of blankets on David, but blankets, they only keep heat in. And David's body isn't generating heat very well, which means David's circulation is probably compromised. And they haven't invented the electric blanket yet. So they found David a beautiful young virgin to be his caregiver, to be like a nurse, to keep him warm. So she's not a hot mama, which could have also kept him warm, but she was the exact opposite because there's nothing immoral in this at all. And so they find this beautiful young virgin named Abishag the Shunammite, which became a part of David's harem to take care of David and all the things that he would need in this part of life. And having a person to warm you up was actually a recognized medical treatment in the ancient world. And so if you're going to get an electric blanket, you might as well get a pretty one. But the one thing that we're told about Abishag that is to be clear to us is that Abishag and David, they never had relations. And the word that's used for Abishag being a virgin is the strongest word for virgin in the Hebrew language, betula, which refers to the wedding sheets. And many people wonder if Abishag, the Shunammite, is the same person as the Shulamite woman in the Song of Solomon, because that would be kind of cool. Solomon in love with Abishag, the Shunammite. But it doesn't seem that they're the same woman, because Shunem is not the same as Shulam. Shunem is the modern-day city of Solom, which is about 6.5 miles north of Nazareth. But now because of David's condition, and now because he's older, he has taken himself out of the public eye. And so he's not keeping up with the daily affairs of what's going on in Jerusalem or in the kingdom. And we find out that David is being taken advantage of by one of his sons. And so I would say this is a type of elder abuse, where his son is trying to secure an inheritance that hasn't been given to him, which happens to be David's kingdom and all the power that goes with it. Where David here is being treated as if his authority doesn't matter anymore, that David's concerns are not relevant, that he's too old, he's too feeble, he's not capable of making his own decisions. And if we take the kingdom away from him, there's nothing he can do about it. Where this son here, he's underestimating David. And it's just like in our world, where a nation can be stolen by an election. In these days, you could steal away a kingdom with a good conspiracy if you had a good plan, where all you need is an opportunist. Someone who looks at a crisis and he asks himself, how can I use this crisis to promote myself and to get what I want? And that's what Adonijah is here. He's an opportunist. And the people, they don't seek out opportunists. Opportunists, they just show up on their own. And Adonijah is a beautiful name. And it comes from two Hebrew words, Adonai, which means Lord, and Yah, which means Yahweh. So this means my Lord is Yahweh. And he was a beautiful man, born to David's wife Haggith, which is not a beautiful name. It makes her kind of sound like she was kind of some kind of old hag, like a witch, maybe with someone with like a wart on the end of her nose. But Adonijah, he was a good-looking man. And it says that he was born after another one of David's son, Absalom, who was also a good-looking man. And saying his mother had borne him after Absalom isn't saying that they had the same mother, but that he's the next in line for the throne. And so Adonijah is the next in the birth order. And even though he's the fourth son of David, he is now the oldest surviving son because all the other sons have died. And so by natural order, Adonijah, he would have been the crown prince, except for that the Lord had selected Solomon to be the next king. Where David was told in 1 Chronicles that it was Solomon that would be the one who would build God's temple. And so Adonijah here, he's believed to be about 35 years old. And if you remember, he was also one of those sons that was born in Hebron when David became king of Judah. And Adonijah, though he knows that Solomon was chosen by God to be the next king of Israel, he believes he deserves David's throne, that it's his birthright. And with David not knowing what's going on in his own kingdom, Adonijah here, instead of choosing to be the sympathetic son in his father's later years, Adonijah chooses to be more like Absalom. He chooses to be aggressive and deceptive and to make coalitions with the people in power by forming a conspiracy and treating his father as an enemy instead of being a friend. And all the things that Adonijah is doing here are all behind his father David's back, where we never hear of him ever stopping by to see his dad or to check in with him to see what David thinks of his plans. Because Adonijah, he's not made himself accountable to David, not as a father nor as a king. But it seems that Adonijah, that he takes his cues from Absalom's playbook, where now he's driving around town in a chariot with men running before him, and he's trying to make himself look like a king, just like Absalom did, because that worked for Absalom. They made him a king. And though David didn't know what his son was planning, and he probably wouldn't have believed it if he was told, but David, he knew about Adonijah and the chariots, but he never said a word to him, because David, he always had a hard time correcting his sons. And it says here that David never rebuked him. And then we read about two men that we know who were always loyal to David, Joab, the commander of the army, and Abiathar the priest, where now they have both sided with Adonijah in his conspiracy, because they too also know that it was Solomon who was to be God's choice to be the next king of Israel. Were these two, they've never sided with Absalom in his overthrow of the kingdom, but here, with the king about to die, they've decided to throw their lot in with Adonijah. And it's pretty easy to understand why Joab would, because Joab and David, they parted ways a long time ago on how the kingdom should be managed. And he probably would do anything he could to stay in power. And Adonijah is giving him that opportunity. And these are two very powerful men. And these are the two men who give Adonijah his credibility. So they're not only rebelling against David, but they're rebelling against God and God's will for Israel. So everything here is being done in secret, which also means that the whole kingdom is unaware of what's going on right in front of their face behind David's back. Where we even see that Bathsheba, she doesn't even know anything until she's finally told by Nathan the prophet. And with Adonijah gaining the support from Joab, that means he has the support of the army. And then by having the support of Abiathar, that gives Adonijah the support of the priesthood, where these two men who had been loyal to David for all these years are traitors. And I hate saying this, but it does seem true that many people that have been your friends earlier in life, they often walk away from you in your later years. And a lot of times it's not only that they walk away from you, but they walk away from the Lord, people that you used to fellowship with. So just like with Absalom, Adonijah, in secret, he has made this great feast, but he doesn't leave town, go down to Hebron like Absalom did. Adonijah, he just goes outside of Jerusalem, only about a half a mile out of town, and he goes down to En Rogel, which is one of the springs that provide water for the city, because they're going to proclaim Adonijah king outside of the sight of the people. So all this is being done secretly. And here they call it a sacrifice, but it's only the fat that's being sacrificed. This is more of a coronation feast. And only the right people were invited. Only those who are part of the conspiracy, but all the other important people of the kingdom who are not a part of the conspiracy, who are loyal to David, they're not invited, which would have been Zadok the priest, Benaiah, the leader of David's personal guard, and Nathan the prophet, because now they're drawing up sides. But all of David's sons, all except for Solomon, were invited, because all the other sons, they're not making any claims to the throne. And Solomon here, he's only about 16, 17 years old at this time. And then with Adonijah running around Jerusalem in his chariots, people may have thought that King David actually laid his hands on Adonijah, that he changed his mind where he actually named Adonijah as the king, because that's what they were trying to get the people to think. But there was no prophet here where something wasn't right, because they don't have the presence of Solomon or the presence of Nathan or Benaiah. Why else be so secretive if all of this was under David's authority? Why would David's faithful men be absent? Because this is just Adonijah proclaiming himself to be the king without any authority from David or from the Lord. And so now we see Nathan the prophet. And the last time we saw Nathan the prophet was way back in 2 Samuel in chapter 12, where Nathan, who is David's friend, rebuked David for his sin with Bathsheba, and where he brought to David the news of how the Lord had forgiven him and how he loved Solomon, and where he gave Solomon that name, Jedediah, beloved by God, where this has to have been at least 17 years before this. And so it's really good to see that this friendship has survived all these years, even after being rebuked. And Nathan is the first to hear of this secret feast. And he understood exactly what it meant, which was the death to all those who are related to the one God had chosen to be the king, which happens to be Solomon. And even here, we haven't heard of Bathsheba or Solomon since that same time of Solomon's birth way back in 2 Samuel chapter 12. So here it's also really good to see that Bathsheba, that she turned out to be quite a noble woman, that she's full of courage and grace, where she also at this time is desiring God's will. And she's trying to make sure that her son will be the next king of Israel according to God's plan. And we see Nathan, he still has a good relationship with Bathsheba. And so Nathan, he goes to her because Bathsheba, she still carries a lot of influence in David's life. But we don't see any of the other of David's wives carrying the same kind of influence on David. And Bathsheba understands what Nathan is telling her, that if Adonijah is allowed to be king, and if nothing is done, that she and her son Solomon will be killed, because any rivals to the throne would be killed. And then Nathan gives Bathsheba the words to go speak to the king. And so she goes in and she asks David 2 questions. Did you not, my lord, O king, swear to your maidservant, saying, assuredly your son Solomon shall reign after me, and he shall sit on my throne? And then she had her second question was, why then has Adonijah become king? And so the key words here is swear, where the word swear is used 4 times here. It's used in verse 13, 17, 24, and 30. Because David had promised that Solomon was to be the next king. And that's because God had told David that Solomon was his choice, where Solomon was to build his temple. But there's no record in the scripture when David ever told all this to Bathsheba. So it was probably years before this. And then Bathsheba, she informs David of Adonijah's coronation feast, and that Joab and Abiathar, they're both there along with all the royal sons, except for Solomon, where Adonijah has proclaimed himself king, and everyone's looking at you to see if this is from you, David. And as she's speaking, Nathan the prophet, he's announced. And so when he comes in, Bathsheba leaves, which is the protocol of when someone goes in to see the king for the wife to leave. And so all of this is going on in David's bedroom with Abishag the Shunammite still taking care of David being present. And Nathan comes in and he asks his 2 questions. And he says, did David announce Adonijah would sit on the throne? And then his second question, had the king done this in secret without telling his servant, the prophet? And Nathan again told David that all his sons were there, all except for Solomon, which is the same thing that Bathsheba said. And then Nathan told David that Abiathar the priest is there along with the army and all the commanders. But Nathan, he didn't mention Joab. But Bathsheba, she had already told David that Joab was at the feast. So David knows that the army is behind Adonijah. And so David, he has a problem because he's going to have to do something, or else how would Solomon ever be able to build the temple, which is David's greatest desire, along with the coming of the Messiah through his seed? And this had to remind David of Absalom in the civil war that tore the land apart. And Solomon, he is not a man of war who can handle this. Solomon's a man of peace, and he's only really just a boy. He's only 16 or 17 years old. So David, he has to respond immediately. And we see here that he is not as feeble as the conspirators have made him out to be, that David is still mentally sharp, that it's only his body that's failing him. So David calls Bathsheba back to his bedside, and David reaffirms his oath to Bathsheba that her son Solomon will be the next king, where Solomon will now become his co-regent on this very day, because this had to be done before Adonijah gained too much strength. Because if David died, there would be no authority that would ever be able to stop Adonijah from taking the throne. So now David, he calls his servants, Nathan the prophet, Zadok the priest, Benaniah the chief of the personal guard, and David instructs them to proclaim Solomon king in a public place. So they have them take Solomon down to Gihon. And Gihon was the main water source for Jerusalem, the Gihon spring. And so at this spring, there would have always been a crowd of people getting water. And this is only less than a mile from En-Rogel, where Adonijah is having his coronation feast. So this wouldn't take very long for Adonijah's coronation party to hear that Solomon has been made the king of Israel. And then David instructs that Solomon is to ride David's personal mule. And in Israel, it was only royalty who rode on mules. And so David's mule would be very recognizable. He had been more famous than even Francis the Mule, because this would be like Solomon taking Air Force One. You know, when you see Air Force One, that it belongs to the president and that the president's probably on board. And if you remember Absalom, he also rode a mule after they proclaimed Absalom to being king. because the common people in Israel, they all rode on donkeys. That's because Israel was not allowed to crossbreed animals, and mules are crossbred. So that means they were all imported, which made them very expensive. And then David instructs that the prophet and the priest, Nathan and Zadok, are to anoint Solomon with God's holy anointing oil. And so it's not just a horn of oil, but it's the horn of oil that came from the tabernacle. So this is the holy oil that was only used for special ceremonies and special anointings. And then the trumpets to be blown, which declares that this is an official event where everyone is to say, "Long live the king," declaring that Solomon is the king and ruler over Israel. Then Solomon is to be brought to the palace and to sit on David's throne. And all the people, they all love this. And they receive Solomon as their king. They were all ecstatic, or they all grabbed their musical instruments and started playing and shouting, "God save King Solomon," which echoed through the whole valley all the way down to Enrogel, which was a mile away. And they're shouting, "God save King Solomon," while these other people are all shouting, "God save King Adonijah." So they're hearing all this noise as they're finishing up their dinner, and they don't really know what they're hearing. And so they're wondering things like, well, did David die? Or are we at war? Until Jonathan, the son of Abiathar, and if you remember, he was one of those spies that brought the news to King David that he should cross over the Jordan during Absalom's rebellion. Where Jonathan here, he's considered to be a good man. So everyone assumed that he is bringing good news. And it was good news. It just wasn't good for them because they're being told that Solomon has been made king. So they're all sitting there and going, whoops. And that was a real party stopper. So this is kind of like when the cops show up, where the people, they just can't get out of there fast enough. But Adonijah, he didn't go to his house, but he went straight to the tabernacle, and not to the one in Gibeon, but he went to the tabernacle that David erected in Jerusalem that contained the Ark of the Covenant. And Adonijah, he grabs onto the horns of the altar, which means he's claiming sanctuary to at least to be heard, to have a delay in judgment before being executed. And you have to see here he is before Solomon, who's only 16, 17 years old. And now he has his older brother who's standing before him, who's like 35 to 40, and he's begging for mercy. Where probably most, they wouldn't have shown him mercy, because he made it obvious that he would have had no problem executing Solomon or Bathsheba. But Solomon tells Adonijah that he won't die if he's good, but if he's not good, he's going to be executed. So Solomon, he sends Adonijah to his house, which is kind of like putting him on house arrest so he can be watched. But it also sends this message that you have no business here at the palace, that you've been retired, you have no official position or duties, so now go home and stay out of trouble. And so Adonijah, he bowed with his body, but he never bowed in his heart, not to Solomon and not to God's will. And it seems strange to me that we don't hear about him going to go talk to his dad to get his dad's approval or his dad's forgiveness, that these kind of things, they don't matter to him at all. That Adonijah doesn't seem to be very close to his dad. He's not even as close as rebellious Absalom was.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh, oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,